Let's get going on assembling our upper receiver. Specifically, we are going to start with the stuff that we have to attach to the barrel first, and that's going to be our barrel itself, our gas block, in my case an adjustable gas block. I haven't played with one yet, and since this will be run suppressed, I'd like to be able to adjust that if necessary, and my correctly lengthed gas tube, and that's going to obviously be determined by the type of barrel I bought and where the gas block goes on that. So that length needs to obviously match the barrel. There are going to be a number of different types of gas blocks. There are ones that are pinned on there. Often they come pinned, and so none of this, what we're about to do, applies to you because it'll come assembled. There are ones that clamp on. Obviously, this doesn't apply to that either. We are talking about the set screw style of gas block, and we are specifically going to talk about just cranking down the set screws to hold it in place, but we are going to go ahead and do, with an additional jig, a dimple job so it stays in place extra nicely. It is not an absolute requirement. There's a lot of people that just snug these down, as I'll talk about in a minute. So if you don't want to buy an additional jig like this dimpling jig, you don't have to. For those of you that fall into that additional category of not wanting to buy an additional jig, all you are going to have to do is take a piece of spaghetti. The closer the spaghetti's diameter is to the diameter of that hole while still fitting in, the better. And what you're going to do is you're going to cut off that piece of spaghetti so it is just flush with the barrel. So you put it down the hole and just use something to chop it off so it's flush. What that is going to allow you to do is take the side of the gas block where you have your hole and line that up with the closer side of the gas journal and slide that on, and then turning the barrel upside down, you're going to just ever so slightly move this around until that spaghetti falls through. That is going to tell you when you are good to go and clamp these set screws down with your appropriately sized Allen wrench. What is the correct amount of tightening for these? Hand tight, and then what I would say a lot of people do, there's no real torque ratings that I found for these, is use the long side of the Allen wrench and tighten it until it gives a little bend. I'm not going to do that because I don't know if it's in the right place and I don't want to mar my barrel surface, but use the long side and then kind of just tighten it until you see it bending. People will talk about using Loctite. This heats up, so I actually don't buy into Loctite being very useful there, but if you don't want to do any dimpling, that's how you can do it. And then obviously when you fire your first round through that, that's going to break the spaghetti and just go out, or you can always take a cleaning rod and break the spaghetti and have it knocked out as well. So that's why I use spaghetti. For this build, we are going to go a little bit more secure, and we are going to dimple this barrel. And so I'm going to use this KAK dimpling jig, and my first step is to find out what spacing these are. Now I can measure them using calipers, or I've found it's pretty easy just to kind of go along and, okay, doesn't fit, doesn't fit, doesn't fit, and I will just go along until I eventually find a spot where, oh, it fits. The opposite side is my spacing. So this particular gas block appears to have a 0.4 inch spacing. What we do with that information is the 0.4 that is opposite from where we're actually going to do our drilling is where we're going to use this set screw. And that set screw, we're going to, for my case, put into the 0.4. And that is going to be, that has a point on the bottom of it. We're going to use this to index into the gas port hole. What I like to do is get it close and then back it off a little bit and sort of move it around. You want to find a spot where you are dang sure that it's in that hole and not sitting on something else. So you see how it's backed off a little bit, but it's not going anywhere. Pretty sure that's that hole. And so I can start cranking it down, and I can incrementally move it tiny bits until I'm pretty dang confident that I'm in the hole itself. be very sure that you are in that hole before you go and start doing any drilling on the other side, because if you're not and you drill in the wrong spot, I don't know how to undo that problem. I think you get a clamp on gas block at that point. That might be an unfixable issue. But once we are happy, we will flip it over and we will do some drilling. We are now on the opposite side, and we are going to use the supplied V-bit in our drill. Very similarly to the advice I gave when we were doing the milling process for our lower. Get the bit in there, then turn it on and press. These barrels are very hard, so these things actually end up cutting pretty dang slowly. If you go too far and you go into the barrel, there's no undoing that. This is now a wrecked barrel. So I would say, regardless of the fact that it moves slowly, small amounts, check frequently. There you can see I've just got the very start of a hole in the bottom of that. I am going to continue going down, and what I'm looking for is only enough of a dimple that the set screw of this gas block can positively register in it without moving out of it. That's it. That's all I need. I'm going to go ahead and do these off camera, and we'll come back and I will show you what I mean by size. You see that size there? That is probably big enough. I'm gonna do the other hole and then I'm gonna pull it off and double check. You can see on the bottom of the set screw the diameter of the point that actually has to be able to sit in your dimple. It is not the full size of that screw. So that's what I was talking about. We just need to make these dimples large enough that that positively indexes into it. And the way that I like to check is by simply taking it, centering it with just some mild pressure, and seeing if I can move it side to side. If it holds itself, that means I've got a good size dimple, and these are good. We won't actually get around to installing and tightening our gas block onto our barrel until after we've installed the barrel onto the upper receiver. That's because our gas tube would get in the way of our ability to tighten our barrel nut. But we are going to go ahead and throw the gas tube onto our gas block though. And this is another pinned operation, so we are going to use our starter punch and finishing punch, like always, with our hammer. And what this operation is there is a kinked section of your gas tube, regardless of what length you're working with. At the opposite end, you're going to have the opening that is going to eventually go over where your gas port is in your barrel. And then at 90 degrees, you're going to have a small pinhole in the side. What we are trying to do is line this up where that big hole will go above the hole in the top of the gas block, and our pinhole will align like that. So that's what we're looking for. See? Once you have it aligned, we are going to use our starter punch with our pin, just like we always do, and we are going to tap that in. You'll see that this is a very short pin, and so you don't actually get much starter. So literally it's just getting it in there and then switching over to drive with the appropriately sized tip punch. But it's no different from any other roll pin we've done before. I would suggest getting something to hold this up like that so that you have something to hit against. It's annoying to try and hit them when they're on their side, but no different from any other pin, so I'm not going to show it. Here's what that should look like once installed. Let's talk preparation for the muzzle device. If you are putting on just a standard muzzle device, flash hider, whatever, you can actually generally just get away with putting a crush washer and tightening it until it hits the crush washer, and then do about a turn until it's timed. Timed being the terminology that people use for the ports being in the direction that you want but just kind of tightening it onto the crush washer until it's nice and timed and it's actually hit the crush washer and it's crushing. I'm going to be running a suppressor on this. So when you put muzzle devices that are used for quick connects for suppressors, you really want them to be sturdy, because if these things are any bit off or come loose, you're going to risk baffle strikes in your suppressor, and that sucks. So we're going to take extra care here that we don't always take in other processes. So specifically what we're going to do is we are going to degrease it, and then we're going to put rock set. Rock set is kind of similar to Loctite, except it handles heat a lot better. So it won't give up with all the heat that's going to be generated up here at the tip of the barrel and on these threads. So we are going to degrease it. I'm using just Zap Industrial purple degreaser from any hardware store, but we're going to get in there real good. And you'll see it'll pull off grease, so there'll be a little color. This one's actually pretty dang clean, to be honest. Added a little more now. I'm gonna do the same thing to the inside threads of this muzzle device. I'm gonna let it sit for a little while, and then we're gonna come back and we're gonna wipe it dry. I ended up getting a CMMG billet upper. I just like the way that these cuts kind of matched the aesthetic of the rest of the build. Sadly, they've already installed the dust cover, and they don't really have an easy way to remove it. So I'm just gonna have to talk you through how you would install a dust cover. So there's a rod that goes into this hole, slides through the dust cover, and a spring into a hole on the other end, and that's what keeps it in place and also gives it that spring. When you first lay everything out, just take your dust cover and put it in place, put your spring in place. The short stick of the spring will be on the inside here, facing up at the back. The longer spring will be facing up when you first put it in. To add spring tension to it, simply grab the stick, tilt up, twist it a half like that, so bring it down, put it there, and just kind of hold it down while you shove the stick in place. Once it's all the way in and has gone through the spring and into the hole at the other side, you're good. The way that a barrel installs on an AR-15 is there is a pin at the top edge of the barrel, and it lines up with a notch in your upper. The barrel simply slides into place. And then we will put the barrel nut, whatever barrel nut is associated with your particular handguard, over that and tighten it. Sometimes when you go to put a barrel into an upper, this is especially true with the Bravo Company manufacturing uppers I've used, you will have a hard time getting that barrel into that upper at all. It will not slide in like that. So what you actually end up doing is just put a heat gun on this until you get to the point that the barrel does enter smoothly. If you did your own Cerakoting of your upper, you may have difficulty if you happened to Cerakote the inside of this extension right here. You may want to take some sandpaper very lightly and remove any Cerakote that you got in there. You'll notice that CMMG did not Cerakote the inside here. I don't know why they didn't Cerakote these threads, that's fine. But that would have changed my clearances, and so it might have been hard to get in there. So sometimes you will have to remove Cerakote. I am using a Magpul bev block to hold this in place. You can also use kind of clamps that go around the upper. This is just one that I 3D printed with a bunch of scrap. You can notice that it actually changes colors as it goes because I just literally used leftovers. So it can be done cheaply. Whenever you have two different types of metal interacting with one another, you can get a situation called galling. And so we actually use a synthetic lubricant. This is lithium grease. It is specifically a aero shell. It is what the military designation requires for AR-15 assembly. And we are going to put some on the barrel extension We are going to put some inside where the barrel extension goes, and we are going to put some on the threads and the inside of our barrel nut. So everywhere we've got potentially different metals meeting, we want to grease those up so that they never gall and we can eventually remove them. This grease goes a long way. This is a billion ARs worth of grease. So I'm just going to take a little bit of this, and we're going to start with our barrel extension. And anything that squeezes out later, we will go ahead and clean up. But for now, don't really worry about it. Just trying to get it nice and covered everywhere. I'll take it out. And also because that gets in the way a little bit. One thing I like to do to make sure we've got good thread coverage is to simply thread on my barrel nut 2 or 3 times. So on and off 2 to 3 times, and that will help disperse that grease into the threads, because getting it into those threads with your finger can be a little difficult. We are ready to insert the barrel. So as simple as it sounds, like I said, if you need the heat gun, use the heat gun. That is in. Now we will do the initial installation of our barrel nut, and we will torque it to spec in just a second. Depending on who manufactured your handguard, you will get one of a million different types of wrench. If it doesn't come with one of 2 kind of standards, it'll generally come with a crow's foot like this. Some common ones you'll see are just a standard style wrench. Here's an Aero Precision one, which is pretty complex. This style is super common as well. This is the Magpul Armorer's wrench, and this is a pretty standard style. And here's another Armorer's wrench, which is what I'll be using, which is this 2-point system here that indexes into the holes that we saw when we were first creating this barrel nut. The torque specs for barrel nuts are pretty wide. The minimum is 30 foot-pounds, all the way up to a maximum of 80 foot-pounds. There's really not a lot of need to go above that lower end. So what I'll generally do is I will set my Torx wrench to 30 foot-pounds. Once we are set to 30 foot-pounds, we will insert it into the slot. Once it's in, we're going to keep it perpendicular to our wrench. Since it's very close to our point of rotation, what it says on the actual wrench is accurate enough for what it's actually going to torque to. And we will torque that down to 30. I'm then going to back it off. We are then going to increase to about 32 foot-pounds of torque. What I'm doing here as I incrementally increase the pressure on the threads is I'm pre-stretching these threads. It's also worth noting that if you did have to heat up your upper in order to get the barrel inside, wait till everything has cooled down before you actually do any of the torquing, because you don't want the heat to have expanded. You torque and then it shrinks down as it cools, and now you're no longer torqued. Well, let's go do 32. I'm once again going to back it off. And now I'm going to go up to 40. You could probably stop at 34, 36, 38. Like I said, anything above 30 is technically the spec. But I'm going to go to 40 here. And I'm a liar. We are not done. I completely forgot that I need to time my barrel nut because these screw holes need to be on the 45 degrees so that my handguard is actually in the correct direction. That's why barrel nuts where timing is required come with shims. And what we're going to do is we're going to pull this off, we're going to add shims and re-torque things, and we're going to do it so that when we torque it, the shim, we have to choose the correct number of them and the correct thickness. These shims will cause this to go back a little bit so that these screw holes are in the correct place. We only need to go back a little bit, so I can probably get away with just doing the thinnest shim, and it's going to be the exact same process as we just saw, but again, testing shims and torque settings. And again, you can use torque to pull it a little more or a little less as needed as well. In the end, I actually ended up needing 3 of those thin shims to get me to where I needed to be. And in my case, you'll know when you're in the right spot because in between these, directly in the center, is the channel for this tube to pass through and the corresponding channel in your upper. So if you don't have it timed correctly on a lot of barrel nuts, not all, but a lot of them, it will not allow this tube to go in. While we were busy getting all of the other stuff onto our barrel, in my case, a lot of it won't fit over this muzzle device. It's given time for the threads that we degreased to dry. Similar to what we saw when we installed our barrel nut, we are going to have to time this muzzle device. It also comes with shims like we saw on the barrel nut. As you can see, my muzzle device bucks up against the shoulder of the barrel threads, and it is nowhere near the correct position. I would be blasting almost straight up and down when I really want to be blasting out left and right. That is where we need to get this muzzle device. And so we are going to have to choose the appropriately thickness and number of shims, because they're not all the same thickness as well, to get it to stop perfectly perpendicular at the right torque setting. All of the different muzzle device manufacturers will have different torque settings that they recommend, so just go with whatever they say. Just like before, we will attach our Torx wrench. We will use the correctly sized opening, in our case it's this one, to torque it to manufacturer spec. However, once we figure out what our shim count and thickness is and what our torque spec is, we're going to take everything back off, and you'll see I'll put rock set on it, and then we'll install everything again and let it sit for 24 hours. I have figured out my required shims. I figured out my torque, so I'm going to apply rock set. I'm going to put a glove on, and I'm going to really get it in there on all the threads, and then we're going to just repeat the install. The reason to pre-do all of your research is that although this takes a good while to fully harden, it starts to thicken pretty quick. And remember, if you're doing something that is a QD for a silencer, then you really don't want anything thick between the end of this and those shims or the edge of the barrel, because you really want this sitting perfectly flat to minimize the risk of baffle strikes. So we want to get this on here pretty quick. And since I already know what the torque spec is for where my muzzle device is perpendicular, I don't actually have to torque it. I can just look down the barrel and torque until it's perfect. There we go. It'll look something like that. We are going to let that sit because you should not shoot on it until it's fully dried. I think it's 24 hours, but don't quote me on that off the top of my head. But while we wait, we are going to put on our handguard. These are the bolts that I'm going to be using. They are titanium Torx head bolts. They are 832 by, I forget what it was, but enough to go through the handguard and into the barrel nut without hitting the barrel. I made them blue by degreasing them with acetone and then just hitting them with a MAP gas torch, which causes titanium to change color. I could not find torque specs for 832 bolts in titanium, but I did find various stainless steel, and it's anywhere from 19.8 to 20.7. So we are going, and that's inch pounds, not foot pounds. So we are going to do, I don't think we need the full 20, so we're going to set it to 17 and torch these on. I will be honest, I am not 100% sure about the crush strength of carbon fiber, so I'm actually going to set this back to just 12 inch pounds, and we're going to increment up, and I'm going to listen as I go. That didn't sound bad at all. Let's go to 14. Fine. 16. Fine. And then 18, which is what I'm going to use. We're good. I'm going to torque all these down. It's nice when a design comes together. Perfect access. In hindsight, I probably would have put the barrel nut on first if I had had this at the time and figured out exactly how much space I had there. I could have put these bolt holes a little more forward to send that back and close that gap, but you live, you learn. Still pretty happy with how this upper came together. The last thing we're going to have to do is attach whatever optic we're going to be using with our build. In my case, this is a precision build, so I am attaching a pretty decently high magnification scope. It just happens to be something that I've got sitting around already in a mount, so why not use that? It goes up to 16 power. If you are using a red dot or like one of those prism scopes that essentially has infinite eye relief, you can kind of just put it anywhere you want. Generally, the recommendation is as far forward on your upper receiver's rail as possible. And that way you're still getting the benefit of having the red dot, but your peripheral vision is not blocked as much. So that's what I would recommend if you're doing a red dot or similar. If we are using a magnified optic, there's going to be a eye relief concern that we're going to have to deal with. What I would suggest doing before attaching anything is put your upper onto your lower, lie down in the prone position, like you would shooting from a laying down position, and then put the scope on. What you're looking for is if you just are very comfortable, eyes closed, face down, and you just raise your head up and open your eyes, the scope should naturally fall in a spot where you have no eye relief issues. And what I mean by that is you won't see any dark ring around any part of the view through the scope. So figuring out where you're going to put it before you actually get to it, very important. So what we're going to do is I've got this loosened up and we are going to get it onto the Picatinny rail. All of these different mounts, they will have torque recommendations from the manufacturer. So go look those up. And basically what we're going to do is we are going to set the torque value on our torque wrench to whatever is recommended. In the case of this particular scope base, the recommended amount is a mere 15 inch pounds. So some of the other torque wrenches we've been using, the larger ones, when we were working on the lower, are foot pounds. These smaller ones, like this Vortex one, is in inch pounds. Very different. Don't let that screw you over. And all we're doing is we are going to, well, one thing, you should be pulling down and forward, because when the bullet fires, it pushes the weapon back. So you really want those lugs for the Picatinny up against the front of that slot. So you can't really see it, but I'm holding it down and forward as I'm tightening these. And for right now, I'm just going to get all of them into a just general tightness, a little bit of grab, and then I'm going to go back and I'm actually going to tighten them down to 15 inch-pounds. All right, so what we're looking for is we're waiting for that click when we've hit the correct inch-pound rating. Actually, I'll turn it sideways so you can see. See how it hit? There we go. We have our scope installed. Now, I do realize I did y'all a disservice. I didn't show putting the actual scope into the scope rings. That's because this was already in one and I didn't really want to take it out, but I'll tell you what to do. Again, you're going to have a torque rating for the screws that use, that attach the rings. On this one, again, it's the same. It's 15 inch-pounds. The other thing to keep in mind here, though, is you need to make sure that your scope is level with the mount so that when it's mounted to your rifle, it's also level. And the way that I like to do that is I take something of an appropriate thickness, you'll see what I mean by that in a second, and it's got parallel edges. And before I fully tighten these screws down, what I will do is there's a flat part right there on the mount. Now, most mounts will have a larger flat part. This one, it's a little tough, but basically I'm gonna put this into that flat part. I'm gonna tilt it up and you'll see that I have no light showing underneath the flat part at the bottom of that scope. So I know that that is perfectly parallel with everything else, and I could tighten those down in that case. So basically get them snug, get this parallel, and then do them to torque. In reality, this is actually where my scope mount ended up being placed after I did all the tests with lying down and looking through it. And a piece of advice is don't just position your scope based on where you like it at one of the magnifications. Try max and try your min magnification, because the eye relief will differ between the two, and you're trying to find a space where you optimize comfort sort of at both of those extremes.